I rented the cabin because I wanted to be alone for a week. It sat at the end of a gravel road that split from the highway and wound through pine forest for almost 5 miles. The listing showed a clean one-room place with a loft bed, a wood stove, and a narrow porch facing a frozen lake. The owner handled everything through email and left a key in a lockbox nailed beside the door. No neighbors were visible from the driveway. That was the appeal. I arrived in late January. Snow covered the ground in a thin, uneven layer. Tire tracks cut through it, but they were old and half filled in. The sky was low and gray. When I stepped out of the car, the air felt dry and sharp in my nose. The forest made a soft, ticking sound as branches shifted in the cold. The cabin looked like the photos. Dark wood siding, metal roof, one window on each side. The lockbox opened with the code I had been given. The key turned without resistance. Inside, the air smelled stale, like shut windows and old fabric. I set my bag down and walked through the space slowly. The floor was clean. The small kitchen counter was bare. A stack of split logs sat beside the stove. The first thing that caught my attention was the temperature. It was warmer than I expected. Not warm enough to be comfortable, but not as cold as a building that had been closed for weeks. I told myself the insulation was better than it looked. I checked the thermostat. It was set low, just above freezing. I unpacked, stacked my food in the cabinet, and laid my sleeping bag on the loft mattress. The mattress felt firm and flat. No dips, no smell. The sheets were folded at the foot of the bed. They looked washed but not freshly pressed. That first evening I built a small fire. The stove drew well. The flames made the room feel smaller and steady. Outside, light faded early. Through the front window I could see the lake, a flat white sheet broken by dark lines where wind had brushed the snow away. I went to bed around 10. The cabin settled as it cooled. Wood popped. The roof made soft clicks. I slept hard. In the morning I noticed the first small thing. The mug I had left on the counter was in the sink. I was certain I had set it beside the stove. I stood still and pictured the night before. I had washed it after tea. I remembered drying it with a paper towel. I remembered placing it near the kettle. Now it sat inside the metal basin. I assumed I had moved it without thinking. Travel makes me careless. I rinsed it again and made coffee. That day I walked along the lake edge. The snow near the cabin showed only my own boot prints and the tracks from my car. The woods beyond were dense, trunks spaced close, underbrush thin from winter. No cabins were visible through the trees. No smoke rose from anywhere. When I returned, the cabin looked unchanged. The door was still locked. Inside, the air felt warmer again, even though the fire had gone out hours before. I checked the thermostat. Same setting. I crouched beside the stove and felt the metal. It was faintly warm. I told myself the insulation held heat longer than I thought. I built another fire and cooked pasta. I ate at the small table near the window. That night, I paid closer attention. I placed my boots side by side beneath the table. I set my flashlight on the counter next to the sink. I left a folded dish towel near the stove. I studied the room before climbing into the loft. Sometime after midnight, I woke with a full bladder. The fire had burned down to red coals. The cabin was dim, lit only by faint moonlight through the window. I climbed down the ladder and stepped onto the floor. My boots were not under the table. They were near the door. I stopped halfway across the room. The front door was closed. The lock was turned. The small chain above it hung loose as I had left it. I felt heat rise up my neck. I did not move for a long time. The silence inside felt different from the forest silence outside. Felt thick. I checked the bathroom. It was empty. I opened the small closet beside the kitchen. Nothing but cleaning supplies. I looked under the table and behind the couch. The space was too small for anyone to hide. I stood in the center of the room and listened. At first, there was nothing. Then, beneath the normal settling sounds, I heard a faint scrape. Came from below my feet. The cabin was raised slightly on concrete blocks. I had seen the crawlspace vents along the base when I arrived. I knelt and pressed my ear to the floor near the stove. The wood was cold against my skin. I heard a slow shifting sound, like fabric brushing against dirt. I backed away. There was no trapdoor in the floor, no visible access point inside. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air hit my face like a slap. I circled the cabin, sweeping the beam along the base. On the far side, partly hidden behind a stack of old boards, I saw a small wooden panel set into the foundation. It was painted the same color as the siding. Snow covered the lower edge. The panel was not secured. One screw lay in the snow beneath it. I did not open it. Instead, I went back inside, locked the door, and pushed the heavy table against it. I dragged the couch beside the table. My hands shook, but I worked carefully, making as little noise as possible. I climbed back into the loft and lay flat, listening. Minutes passed. Then I heard it clearly. A slow, controlled movement under the floor. A weight shifting from one side to the other. The sound of someone adjusting position. I stayed awake until morning. When light came, I packed my bag. I kept the table against the door until I was ready to leave. Then I moved it just enough to slip outside. The panel on the side of the cabin was closed again. The loose screw was gone. I drove down the gravel road without stopping. When I reached cell service, I called the county sheriff. 2 deputies met me at a gas station near the highway. I explained what I had heard and what I had seen. They drove back with me. At the cabin, they checked the interior first. Nothing appeared disturbed beyond what I described. They moved the furniture and unlocked the side panel. Inside the crawl space, they found bedding, blankets layered over cardboard, a small battery lantern, empty food cans, a plastic container filled with water. There was enough room between the beams for someone to lie flat and move from one end of the cabin to the other. They also found a second key to the front door. The crawl space extended the full length of the cabin. Near the area beneath the loft, there was a narrow opening cut into the subfloor. From below, someone could push up a square of wood that had been carefully sawed along the grain. From above, the cut lines were almost invisible, hidden beneath a rug. The deputies lifted the rug and pressed on the wood. It shifted slightly. They found fresh boot prints in the dirt under the cabin. The pattern did not match mine. Later that afternoon, they caught the man less than a mile away, walking through the trees with a backpack. He had been staying under the cabin for weeks. The property owner had not visited since early fall. The man had worked maintenance jobs in the area and knew which places sat empty through winter. He watched for rental listings and waited until someone arrived. He preferred cabins with crawl spaces and simple locks. He told the deputies he never meant to hurt anyone. He said he needed warmth and shelter. He entered while guests were out walking and left before they returned. If they stayed inside, he waited under the floor. He moved small objects at night to make people uneasy so they would leave early. The warmth I felt had come from his body heat and a small camping stove he used carefully under the floorboards. The boots had been moved when I slept. He had lifted the cut panel and stepped quietly into the room. He carried a spare key in case the door chain was set. The owner later admitted the side panel had once been secured with a proper latch, but it had rotted and fallen off. He had not replaced it. I did not return to collect the rest of my belongings. The deputies retrieved them and mailed them to me. I canceled the rental and never received a refund. For weeks after, I woke at night thinking I heard a soft scrape beneath my bed. In my apartment, the sounds were only pipes and heating vents. Still, I checked the floor more than once. What unsettled me most was not the man himself, but how close he had been. The cabin had seemed empty and clean. The forest had seemed quiet and still. Yet someone had been inches below me, listening to my breathing, waiting for the moment I stepped outside. There were no hidden forces, no unexplainable events. There was only a neglected panel, a second key, and a person who learned how to stay out of sight. That knowledge stays with me longer than any winter silence. I rented the cabin at the end of January because I needed quiet and because it was cheap. The listing said it sat alone on 12 acres of mixed pine and birch, 5 miles from the nearest paved road. The photos showed a wood stove, a narrow bed under a window, a small porch facing a frozen lake. The owner had left a lockbox on the railing and told me the plow came only after heavy snowfall. That suited me. I wanted space and no interruptions. The drive-in took longer than I expected. The last mile was a rutted track with ice pressed hard into the ground. Branches scraped along both sides of my car. When I reached the clearing, the cabin looked smaller than it had in the photos. The roof sagged slightly in the center. Smoke stains marked the metal chimney. The lake behind it was a flat sheet of white with wind pushing loose snow across the surface in thin streaks. Inside, the air smelled like cold wood and old ash. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, a couch with a faded blanket, and the stove. A short hallway led to a bathroom and a storage room. The windows were old single panes with frost tracing lines along the edges. The owner had left a stack of split logs under the porch and a metal shovel by the door. The first 2 days were calm. I kept the stove burning and listened to the wood pop and settle. I walked the edge of the lake in the mornings, staying close to shore. The ice looked thick, but I did not trust it. There were no other houses in sight, no tire tracks besides mine. The silence was steady and clean. I slept hard at night. On the 3rd morning, I noticed footprints near the woodpile. They were not mine. I wear boots with a wide tread that leaves a clear diamond pattern. These were narrower, deeper at the heel, and they came from the tree line toward the porch. They stopped at the stack of logs. A few pieces were missing from the top row. I stood still and looked at the clearing. The snow on the ground was smooth except for those prints. No fresh vehicle tracks cut through the road. The cabin door was still locked. I told myself the owner might have stopped by before I arrived and taken wood. The snow had fallen lightly the night before. The edges of the prints were soft but not filled in. I walked the perimeter of the clearing. The tracks led back into the trees and faded where the ground was uneven. The forest floor held less snow under the branches, so the trail broke apart. I felt exposed standing there. The trunks were close together, dark and straight. It would be easy for someone to watch the cabin without being seen. I went back inside and checked the windows. All were latched. The storage room held canned food, tools, a small generator, and 2 5-gallon cans of fuel. Nothing looked disturbed. I told myself not to overreact. This was private land but not fenced. Someone could have cut through the property. A hunter, a hiker. It was not illegal to walk in the woods. That afternoon I kept glancing toward the tree line. The stove needed steady feeding, so I brought in more wood than usual and stacked it near the door. I placed the shovel inside as well. When night fell, the darkness felt thicker than before. The cabin light pushed only a short distance past the windows. Beyond that was black. I woke at some point after midnight to a dull sound. It was not loud, more like weight shifting on the porch. I held still and listened. The stove had burned low, so the room was cold. I heard a scrape along the outside wall, slow and controlled. My heart began to pound. I reached for my phone on the table beside the bed. There was no service out there. I had known that from the start. The sound moved toward the woodpile. A log rolled and thumped against the boards. Then quiet. I stayed in bed and waited. After a long stretch, I forced myself up and added wood to the stove. I did not turn on any extra lights. I did not look out the windows. I sat in the chair until the sky began to lighten. In the morning, the porch showed new prints. The same narrow tread. They came up the steps and stopped in front of the door. The person had stood there for a while. The snow was packed flat in a wide oval. From there, the prints led to the woodpile again. 3 more logs were gone. The realization settled slowly. Someone was close enough to hear me move inside. Someone knew I was alone. They were taking wood to stay warm. That meant they were not passing through. They were camped somewhere nearby. I went into the storage room and found a metal hatchet. I kept it on the table. I also found a small motion light in a drawer and fixed it above the porch with screws from the toolbox. It was old but worked when I tested it. That afternoon, I followed the tracks into the trees. I moved slowly, watching the ground. About 50 yards in, I found a shallow depression between fallen logs. A blue tarp was stretched low and tied to branches. Beneath it were 2 blankets, a backpack, and an empty can of beans. The snow around the spot was trampled flat. The backpack was worn and dirty. I did not open it. I did not want to escalate anything. I stepped back carefully, placing my boots in my own prints, and returned to the cabin. My plan shifted from waiting to leaving. The road might not be plowed, but my car had handled worse. I began packing my things into bags. As I carried the first load to the car, I felt watched. The tree line looked unchanged, but I sensed movement behind the trunks. I loaded everything quickly and went back inside for the last items. When I opened the storage room door, I froze. One of the fuel cans was missing. The generator still sat in place. Only one can was gone. That meant the person had been inside the cabin while I slept. The door had been locked. The only other entry was a small window in the storage room, set higher than eye level. I looked at it closely. The latch was bent. I stepped outside and checked the side of the cabin. There were scuff marks on the wall below that window. Snow was packed down in two spots where someone had stood. They had pried the latch, climbed in, taken fuel, and left without disturbing anything else. My fear shifted into anger. I did not like the thought of someone moving through the room while I lay a few feet away. I finished packing and started the car. The engine struggled in the cold but turned over. I left the cabin door locked and drove down the track. Halfway to the paved road, I saw a figure ahead. A man stood near the bend, thin and layered in mismatched clothing. He held the missing fuel can. He did not step into the road, but he did not move away. His face looked raw from cold. He watched the car approach. I slowed but did not stop. There was space to pass on the left. As I edged around him, I saw how young he was, maybe mid-20s. His eyes were flat and tired. He gripped the can with both hands as if it anchored him. I drove straight to the nearest town and went to the sheriff's office. I reported everything. The footprints, the break-in, the camp in the woods. Deputies returned with me that afternoon. They found the tarp shelter empty. A short distance away, they found the man trying to start a small fire with damp wood and the stolen fuel. He had been living in the forest for weeks after losing his job and his apartment. He had no car. He had seen the cabin sit empty through most of winter and assumed it was unused. When I arrived, he panicked but chose to stay because he had nowhere else to go. He took wood at night to avoid contact. He entered the storage room when the temperature dropped below zero and he ran out of dry fuel. The sheriff arrested him for trespassing and burglary. I watched from a distance as they led him to the cruiser. He did not resist. He looked more exhausted than dangerous. I never went back to the cabin. The owner refunded part of my stay and fixed the window latch. I still think about how close he had been while I slept, how thin the wall was between us. There had been no monster in the woods, no mystery beyond a man trying to survive. That fact did not make those nights easier. The fear came from something real, someone close enough to touch the door, someone who knew I was there and waited in the dark. I hadn't planned on staying long. The cabin belonged to a friend of my father's, a man I'd met a handful of times when I was younger. It was set back deep in the northern woods, off a gravel road that curved through dense pines and birch. The last half mile was little more than a rough track, and winter had left it pocked with icy ruts. I arrived mid-afternoon, hauling a duffel filled with minimal supplies. The snow had started melting in patches, leaving the ground soft and uneven. The smell of wet earth and pine sap thick in the air. The cabin itself was small, a single story with a steeply pitched roof, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch sagging slightly under years of neglect. The windows were clouded, streaked with old rain and dust, and the front door was a dull gray that had long since lost its paint. Inside, the air was damp and musty. A wood stove sat in the center of the main room, its blackened surface still holding the faint smell of last year's fire. The floorboards creaked under my weight, uneven and soft in places. A narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, and the walls were lined with pine paneling that had darkened with age. I set my bag down and ran my hand over the counter in the small kitchen. Everything felt heavy and used. Dust motes floated in the beams of afternoon light, moving slowly in the air, suspended like the cabin itself was holding its breath. I spent the first few hours unpacking and organizing. The stove needed cleaning, the water lines had frozen and cracked in several places, and the small propane heater rattled when it kicked on. The wind outside pressed against the walls, a low, constant groan that carried through the windows. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but later the sound became sharper, more deliberate. I noticed small things. The uneven steps leading down to the lake behind the cabin, a log that had fallen against the porch railing, the way shadows gathered in corners even in the daylight. By late afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding woods. The snow had left the trails muddy, and the ground sank under my boots. I followed the slope down to the edge of a narrow ravine the locals called the Cut. The drop was steep, lined with jagged rocks and scrubby brush. It had that raw, unfinished feeling, like the land had been left to itself for decades. I saw signs of animals, tracks I couldn't identify, broken branches, tufts of fur caught on thorns. I tried to dismiss the uneasy feeling that came with it, telling myself it was just isolation, the way the mind latches onto silence when no one else is around. The first night, the cabin felt alive in ways I hadn't expected. Every creak, groan, and snap of settling would set my nerves on edge. I had eaten a simple dinner and gone to bed early, but sleep was shallow. I woke several times to the sound of the wind, or what I thought was the wind, but the noises were closer, sharper, sometimes accompanied by the scraping of something heavy against wood. I told myself it was branches, raccoons, maybe deer dragging themselves through brush. By the second morning, I was pacing inside the cabin, checking the doors and windows, even though I knew they were sturdy and locked. The feeling of being watched clung to me. I spent the next day repairing the stove and heater. The work gave me focus, but even then, shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. The forest pressed closer with every hour. The sunlight barely reached the forest floor, filtered through thick branches, leaving dim, green-tinged light even at midday. I noticed small oddities. Footprints in the mud that didn't match mine. A smell that was metallic, faint, lingering near the back door. At night, the noises returned, more insistent, scraping and shifting, always on the other side of the walls. I began leaving the kitchen knife on the counter within reach, even though I knew it would do nothing against whatever was out there. The second night was the worst. Snow had started falling again, soft at first, then in heavier flakes that blanketed the roof and porch. I was in the main room watching the stove when I heard it. A series of deliberate knocks against the cabin's exterior, low and measured. Not a branch, not wind. My stomach dropped. I pressed myself against the far wall, listening. The knocks repeated, moving around the perimeter, and then silence. I couldn't tell how long it lasted, but when I finally dared to move, I checked the windows. Nothing. The snow had left a smooth layer. No footprints, no disturbance. I tried to reason with myself, to explain away the noises as animals or wind, but each sound in the coming days made my nerves tighten. I began keeping a log, writing down times and what I heard. Scraping along the porch, thumps on the roof, small taps at the door. Sometimes, the noises would stop abruptly, as if whatever made them was aware of my attention. I noticed the way the shadows in the room seemed to move independently of light sources. I started checking the locks multiple times, even the ones I knew were secure. On the fourth day, I went out to gather firewood despite the falling snow. The forest was quieter than usual, the snow muffling sounds, but I felt eyes on me. When I reached the pile of logs near the ravine, I realized some had been moved, stacked differently than I remembered. Panic started in my chest, a tight, suffocating feeling. I stepped back and nearly slipped on the icy ground. When I looked up, I thought I saw movement among the trees, but the snowfall obscured everything. I returned to the cabin, carrying only what I could, and kept the door locked behind me. I slept fitfully that night. I dreamt of being outside the cabin, seeing footprints in the snow that led nowhere, hearing my own footsteps behind me even though I was alone. I woke drenched in sweat, the wind howling like it was inside the cabin, and the scraping had started again. It went on for hours. At first, I thought it would never end. Then, near dawn, A sound like a heavy branch snapping came from the ravine. It was followed by a loud thump, like something landing at the bottom. I didn't sleep again until mid-morning. By the 6th day, I had started preparing to leave. I loaded the duffel and made a mental checklist of everything to do. I noticed a set of tracks in the snow outside, near the back of the cabin. Small, light, human-sized, leading from the woods to the porch and then back again. They stopped at the snowbank, as if whoever or whatever made them had vanished. I stared at them for a long time, then decided I didn't want to see more. I made my way down the track toward the gravel road, the snow crunching under my boots, the forest silent around me. I didn't look back. When I returned home, I explained to my father's friend that I couldn't stay longer. He didn't press, only asked if I'd been cold or if the stove had worked. I didn't mention the noises or the tracks. The cabin had a history of being isolated, he said, of wildlife and shifting land. He didn't know about the tracks, the scraping, or the sense of being watched. I never returned. In the years since, I've driven past the turnoff a few times, noticing the deep, quiet woods, the bend of the road, and the way the sun rarely touches the forest floor. I can picture the cabin, the sagging porch, the darkened paneling inside, the stove that always seemed to echo the creaks of the building itself. I remember the heavy silence that pressed in, and the sense that someone or something was moving just beyond sight. It was nothing I could explain, nothing I could prove, but it was enough. Enough that the cabin, for me, became more than an empty building. It became a place that held the weight of being watched, a slow and steady reminder that isolation can turn ordinary spaces into something oppressive, a place that will remain in my memory long after the snow melted and the woods returned to their quiet state. I drove the last stretch of the road slowly, the gravel crunching under the tires, the forest pressing in from both sides until it felt like the trees would meet overhead. The cabin wasn't far from a small river that cut through the valley, though the road ended long before reaching it. I had never been out this far alone, not for longer than a few hours, and the idea of spending a week in a place that had been empty for months made my chest tighten. I told myself it was just work, some repairs and cleaning before winter set in, but there was a quiet unease in the air I couldn't shake. The air smelled cold, sharp, with damp pine and earth, and every time I exhaled, it felt like it fogged in front of my face just long enough to hide something I wasn't ready to see. The cabin sat in a small clearing. It was older than I expected, built from dark logs, with a low, pitched roof and a stone chimney that had clearly seen years of use. The windows were small, the glass wavy and clouded with age. I parked near the front door, got out, and let the silence hit me fully. There were no sounds of cars, planes, or even birds, just the faint rush of the river a few hundred yards away and the occasional groan of wind through the branches. I grabbed my pack and made my way to the door, noting the way the frost clung to the logs in intricate patterns. The latch was stiff, but it gave way, and I pushed the door open. The smell of the cabin hit me immediately, with smoke from last season, dust, and something faintly metallic, like iron or wet soil. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. A main room with a stone fireplace dominated the space. The hearth was cold, but I could see the blackened stones where fires had burned deep into the winter nights. A few old chairs, a long wooden table, and some shelves lined the walls. Dust coated everything, disturbed only by a thin trail of footprints that must have been left by the owner months ago. I set down my pack and ran my hand along the table, feeling the grooves in the wood, the knots, the slight splintering. Every detail made the cabin feel alive in its own way, a place that had been used and weathered, not just abandoned. I spent the first day cleaning. I swept the floors, dusted the shelves, and repaired a few broken boards on the window frame. The work was quiet, almost meditative, but there was a constant awareness of the woods outside. Shadows shifted between the trees, and the angle of the sunlight changed with startling speed. I noticed how the wind moved differently here, rustling leaves in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, and I found myself pausing more often than I expected, listening to the subtle creaks of the cabin settling, the occasional snap of a branch far off. By evening, the air had cooled, and I lit the fireplace, the first real warmth I had felt since arriving. The fire crackled, the scent of burning pine filling the room, and for a moment I felt completely alone but not lonely. That night, the silence seemed to stretch even further. I had eaten a simple dinner, reheated from a pack I had brought, and as I washed the pan in the sink, I noticed the way the shadows danced along the walls. Every noise, the groan of the floorboards, the hiss of the fire was magnified. I tried to read, but the words blurred. I found myself staring at the window, watching the dark outlines of trees, waiting for something I couldn't name. When I finally went to sleep, I left the fire smoldering low and curled under a heavy blanket. Every few hours, I woke to the sound of wind shifting in the trees or the floorboards creaking, but nothing ever approached the cabin. The next morning, I explored the perimeter. The snow had fallen lightly overnight, dusting the ground and covering the old footprints from the previous season. I noticed the river more clearly now, dark and fast, cutting a path through the forest like a scar. I followed the edge for a short distance, taking care not to slip on hidden ice. The trees were dense, their trunks thick and close together, and I realized that no one would see me here without being very close. I understood then why the cabin had remained empty for months at a time. The isolation was complete. I returned to the cabin, wet and chilled, and stoked the fire, drying my clothes on the stone hearth. As the days passed, the cabin became a rhythm. I woke with the first light, worked on small repairs, chopped wood for the fireplace, and took short walks along the river or through the forest. Each day the quiet grew heavier, the sense of being watched more pronounced, though nothing ever approached me. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, not with creatures or spirits, but with an awareness patient and indifferent. I began noticing details I had overlooked. How some branches seemed unnaturally broken, how a patch of moss had been pressed down as if someone had knelt there recently, though I saw no tracks. The cabin felt less like a building and more like a point of observation, a space that recorded every movement in the surrounding forest. Midweek, I discovered the first real disturbance. I had left a window slightly open to air the cabin, and when I returned, a few items on the table had been nudged, papers shifted slightly. My first thought was the wind, though there was little enough to reach that far. I checked the doors, the locks, the ground outside, no footprints. I told myself it was nothing, a simple shift, and continued my work. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, or at least that the cabin expected someone to be. The final days were tense. I moved more cautiously, checking each window and listening carefully before stepping outside. I kept a small hatchet near the door, more out of habit than fear. One night, I woke to a faint sound, almost imperceptible, a low dragging along the frozen ground outside. My first instinct was to reach for the hatchet, but I stayed still, listening. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I lay awake for hours, tracing the sounds of the forest, the river, the wind, and eventually drifted back to sleep, exhausted. When it came time to leave, I packed quickly, my hands shaking slightly from the cold and tension. I left the cabin as I had found it, save for the minor repairs and clean surfaces. I locked the door, stepped onto the frozen gravel, and took a deep breath of the sharp, cold air. As I drove away, the trees lining the road seemed to close behind me, and the silence behind the cabin felt absolute. The work had been done, the cabin safe for the next visitor, but the memory of those days lingered. The weight of solitude, the subtle disturbances, the sense that the forest had its own attention, watching and waiting. I didn't return for months, and when I did, it was with someone else. The cabin had not changed, but I knew I would never experience it the same way again. Alone, it had felt alive in a way that could not be explained, shaped entirely by the small details and the patient, constant quiet. The work had been done, the repairs solid, and I had proven to myself I could endure the isolation. But the forest and the cabin had left a mark, subtle but undeniable. Even now, years later, I remember the smell of the fire, the feel of the frost on the logs, and the slow, pressing silence of that place, and I know it will stay with me forever. I drove the last mile on the narrow dirt track with the engine grumbling under the cold, uneven ruts, watching the sun dip behind the ridge. The forest was dense, a wall of pines and firs with snow clinging stubbornly to their needles even though winter was ending. The cabin was tucked into a small clearing, almost swallowed by the trees, and from the road it looked smaller than I expected. The boards were weathered and darkened, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. A thin trail of smoke drifted from the chimney, marking it as lived in, but no one was there to greet me. I had the keys, and that was all I needed. The previous week, I had agreed to spend 2 weeks alone here. The owner, a distant friend of my uncle, had gone on a long trip and asked me to keep the cabin occupied. He warned me about the weather, the thin ice on the nearby creek, and to be careful around the steep ravine behind the cabin. I had brushed it off as overcautious advice, thinking it was just the typical warnings a solitary cabin might demand. But standing there, I felt a quiet weight in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, faintly sour, and cold air carried the scent of damp pine from outside. The main room was small, with a stone fireplace and a worn rug that had seen decades of boots and mud. The furniture was sparse. A table with 2 chairs, a single bed in the corner, a small bookshelf with dog-eared novels, and a stack of old National Geographics. I set my bag down and walked to the window facing the ravine. The drop was steep, jagged rocks visible through the trees, and a thin ribbon of water snaked along the bottom. The sun had gone completely now, and the shadows in the forest stretched long and uneven. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I lay in bed, listening to the wind shiver through the pines, thinking about the last time I'd spent even a few nights alone in the woods. There were no owls calling, no distant barking of coyotes, just the faint groan of the cabin itself as the boards shifted. Around midnight, I heard a soft crunching outside, like boots stepping over frozen snow. I froze, heart thudding. The sound didn't repeat. I pressed my ear against the wall. Nothing. Sleep came eventually, fitful and shallow. The next morning, I went down to the creek to fetch water. The path was narrow, lined with frost-hardened grass and slick with ice. The creek's edge was jagged and uneven, the current running faster than I expected for this time of year. I filled the metal canteen and watched the water swirl. On the opposite bank, the snow was disturbed in a straight line leading into the forest. Footprints, human-sized, disappearing into the shadows of the pines. My stomach sank, but I told myself they were old, from hunters or hikers passing through. I had no choice but to move on, to keep busy with chores around the cabin. I spent the day stacking firewood and cleaning the stove, noticing details I had ignored the first night. The faint scratches along the door frame, almost like someone had tested the latch repeatedly, and the way the shadows shifted in the corners of the room as the sun moved. By late afternoon, I felt uneasy, a slow creeping tension that pressed against my chest. Every creak of the floorboards, every tap of ice falling from the roof sounded louder than it should. That night, the crunching returned. It started softly, just outside the cabin, then closer, circling the structure. I stayed frozen under my blanket, listening. It wasn't the sound of animals. It was deliberate enough that I could tell someone or something was pacing, watching. My mind raced through possibilities. A hiker lost in the forest, a hunter passing by, someone curious about an empty cabin. The sound stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was heavier than the first night, oppressive, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. Over the following days, small signs accumulated. Footprints near the back door, faint and fresh. Some of the firewood I had stacked moved slightly, as though brushed aside. The wind shifted oddly at night, carrying sounds from the ravine. Rocks dislodging, branches snapping, that had no explanation. I didn't sleep well, and my routine started to unravel. I tried to stay busy, cooking simple meals, walking to the creek, sharpening the axes. Each day, the forest felt closer, more oppressive, as though it were pressing in on the cabin itself. On the 5th night, I woke to a low rumble, the sound of distant movement through the underbrush. My heart raced as I realized it was coming from the direction of the ravine. I slipped into boots and grabbed the lantern, my hands trembling, and stepped outside. The air was bitter cold, but nothing moved in the clearing. I followed the faint trail of footprints to the edge of the ravine. There, I saw signs that made my stomach drop. Torn strips of fabric clinging to the branches, deep gouges in the bark, and the snow disturbed in an unnatural pattern leading toward the creek. It was clear someone, or multiple someones, had been here recently, moving around at night, exploring. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, ignoring the heavy feeling in my chest, and drove back down the rough road. At the main highway, I stopped to catch my breath, realizing I had been holding it the whole way. I didn't see anyone on the road, and when I glanced in the rearview mirror, the forest looked as ordinary as ever. But the unease didn't leave me. Weeks later, I found out from the owner that the cabin had been broken into the previous winter. Nothing had been stolen, but someone had used it as a temporary shelter. I understood then that the forest had its watchers, quiet and careful, and that I had been in the middle of their domain without knowing it. I went back once, months later, during daylight with a friend. We stayed only a few hours, walking the edges of the clearing and peering into the ravine. It looked peaceful in the sun, the water glittering and the trees soft in the wind. But I knew what I had felt at night, knew the way the forest could feel like a living presence, patient and observing. The cabin had not changed, but I had. I had learned that isolation is not only about being alone, but about being visible to forces you cannot see and cannot control. In the end, the experience left me cautious, not reckless. I realized the forest's horror was not in ghosts or monsters, but in human vulnerability. The knowledge that someone else could be moving unseen, that the familiar could become alien in silence. I kept the memory vivid, and whenever I drive past similar stretches of trees, I notice the subtle signs, the faint disturbances, and I remember the weight of the silence that pressed in from every direction at that cabin, near the ravine, where the forest had watched and I had learned to respect it. The lesson was clear, permanent, and inescapable. Solitude in the woods is never absolute, and the forest has eyes even when you think it does not.